August 15th, 2024. Mike Tyson hadn't thrown a punch in anger for 20 years, not since the night that changed everything. Razor McCann walked into Mel's diner with 12 Hell's Angels behind him, 200 people eating Sunday breakfast. McCann spotted Mike in the corner booth, walked straight over and spit in his face. 30 neighborhood kids froze. Mackenzie smiled like a man holding all the cards. "You remember my brother, don't you, champ?" The question hung in the air like smoke, because Mike did remember. Newark, 1991, a dark alley, a choice that saved one life and took another, the secret he'd buried under 15 years of redemption. What happened next became legend in the streets. The Hells Angels never spoke of it, the kids never forgot it, and Mike Tyson proved that some debts can only be paid in truth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You made a mistake coming here, son. Mike's voice carried the weight of 15 years in Detroit's underground, each word measured like punches in a championship bout. The spit still clung to his black t-shirt, but he didn't wipe it away. His gray eyes that had stared down Holyfield Lewis and a dozen other legends, locked onto Johnny's face with predatory calm. Johnny Castellano laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the factory's rusted beams. "Mistake? Old man, I own half the crews in this city. You're running fights on my territory without paying tribute." He gestured at the crowd of spectators pressed against the makeshift ring barriers. "All these rich boys throwing around daddy's money, and you think you can keep it all?" The warehouse fell silent except for the distant hum of Detroit traffic and the occasional creak of settling metal. Mike studied Johnny's face, the sharp jawline, the arrogant smirk, the way his left eyebrow had a small scar cutting through it. Something familiar flickered in the back of Mike's mind, a ghost of recognition that made his stomach tighten. "I pay my dues to the people who matter," Mike said, stepping closer. At 6'3", he still had 2 inches on the gang leader, and despite his age, his shoulders filled out his shirt like a man who'd never stopped training. "Question is, do you?" Johnny's smile faltered for half a second before returning full force. "You know what I think? I think Iron Mike lost his iron when he started running these underground freak shows instead of taking real fights." He turned to address the crowd, arms spread wide. "Ladies and gentlemen, the great Mike Torino, reduced to watching other men bleed for money." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the spectators, wealthy thrill-seekers from Grosse Pointe in Birmingham, who came to the abandoned factories for authentic violence they couldn't buy in their suburban bubbles. But most stayed quiet, sensing the electricity crackling between the two men in the ring. Mike's hands remained at his sides, but everyone who knew him recognized the stillness. It was the same calm that preceded his legendary knockouts, the moment when Iron Mike became something more dangerous than human. "You want to know about blood?" Mike's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the warehouse. "I've seen more of it than you can imagine, boy. Spilled more than you ever will. The question you should be asking yourself is simple. Are you ready to add yours to the collection?" Johnny's hand moved instinctively toward the knife on his belt, but he caught himself. Even with his crew of 8 bikers backing him up, something in Mike's tone made violence feel like a losing proposition. "Big words from someone who hasn't thrown a real punch in 15 years, Johnny shot back. But his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "I heard stories about what made you quit the professional circuit. Something about losing control, right? About crossing lines that can't be uncrossed?" The words hit Mike like a body shot. His jaw clenched, and for a moment the warehouse seemed to shrink around him. 15 years ago, a dirty cop named Detective Ray Castellano demanding he throw fights. The confrontation in this same neighborhood. Hands that were meant for boxing doing something that haunted his dreams. Castellano. The name clicked into place like a bullet sliding into a chamber. Mike's eyes found Johnny's face again, the jawline, the scar, the way he held his shoulders. Not just familiar, inherited. "What's your real name, son?" Mike asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Johnny Castellano. And before you ask, yeah, I'm named after my old man, Detective Ray Castellano. Tough cop who knew how to handle tough guys." Johnny's chest puffed with pride. "He taught me everything about respect before some coward took him out 15 years ago. Shot him in an alley like a dog." The lie twisted in Mike's gut. Ray Castellano hadn't been shot. He died from blunt force trauma after trying to extort the wrong fighter. After threatening to destroy Mike's career and family if he didn't play ball with the betting syndicates. The official report called it a mugging gone wrong. But Mike remembered every detail of that night, the sound of bones breaking, the moment when controlled violence became something else entirely. Now Ray's son stood in his ring, spitting on him, demanding tribute, with no idea he was staring into the eyes of his father's killer. Mike took a deep breath, tasting dust and motor oil and the metallic scent of fear sweat from the crowd. Around them, 200 people waited for violence. Johnny's crew fingered their weapons. The underground fighters scheduled for tonight's matches watched from the shadows, wondering if they'd still have jobs in an hour. "Respect," Mike said finally, his voice carrying 15 years of guilt and rage and desperate control. "That's what this is about, isn't it? Teaching an old man about respect?" Johnny nodded, confidence returning. "Finally getting it through your thick skull." Mike smiled then, a cold expression that made several spectators step backward. "Then let me give you a lesson your daddy never could. Get out," he said simply. Johnny blinked, confusion replacing the anticipation of violence. "What? You heard me. Take your crew and leave. This is my house, and I'm telling you once, get out before I change my mind about being civil." The gang leader's face flushed red. He'd come here expecting submission or bloodshed, not dismissal. "You think you can just—" "I think," Mike interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd commanded millions of dollars in pay-per-view audiences, "that you're young and stupid and breathing because I'm allowing it. Don't test my generosity." Johnny's crew shifted nervously. Whatever reputation had brought them here evaporated in the face of Mike's controlled menace. After a moment of strained posturing, Johnny spat again, this time on the canvas at Mike's feet. "This isn't over, old man." "Yes," Mike said, watching as Johnny and his bikers pushed through the crowd toward the warehouse exit. "It is." The spectators began to disperse, the promise of violence unfulfilled, leaving them restless and disappointed. Mike stood alone in the ring, staring at the spot where Johnny had been, seeing instead a younger version of Detective Ray Castellano. The same arrogant stance, the same assumption that intimidation could replace intelligence. "Boss?" Marcus Williams approached the ring, his fighter's instincts reading the tension that still radiated from Mike's shoulders. At 28, Marcus had been fighting in Mike's underground circuit for 3 years, working his way up from desperate street brawls to headlining matches that drew serious money. More than that, he'd become the closest thing Mike had to family in this hollow world they'd built together. "You good?" Marcus asked, climbing through the ropes. Mike finally wiped the spit from his shirt, the gesture mechanical and delayed. "Fine, just punks being punks." But Marcus had been around violence long enough to recognize its aftershocks. "That kid said his name was Castellano. Mean something to you?" "Everything." The word echoed in Mike's mind, but he just shrugged. "Old name from the neighborhood, probably just coincidence." Marcus nodded, but his dark eyes stayed concerned. "Want me to keep an ear out? Make sure they don't come back with more friends?" "No." Mike's response came too quickly, too sharp. He forced himself to soften it. "I mean, it's handled. Kid's got more mouth than sense, but he's not stupid enough to push this further." The lie tasted bitter. Johnny Castellano was exactly that, stupid, young, and angry, and carrying his father's legacy like a loaded gun he didn't know how to use safely. Mike had seen that combination before, in the mirror and in 100 other fighters who thought violence was strength instead of weakness wearing a disguise. Around them, the warehouse began its familiar transformation as the underground support crew set up for the evening's scheduled fights. Folding chairs arranged in rough bleachers, betting boards wheeled out from storage, the medical station where Dr. Sarah Chen, a trauma surgeon who'd lost her license to gambling debts and now stitched up fighters for cash, prepared her equipment with clinical efficiency. This was Mike's world now, not the bright lights of Vegas or the roar of 20,000 fans, but the shadows of Detroit's forgotten places where desperate men fought for money and spectators paid premium prices for authentic brutality. It wasn't noble, but it was honest in ways his championship career had never been. "Marcus!" Mike's voice stopped the younger fighter as he headed toward the locker area they'd constructed from shipping containers. "The main event tonight, you feeling ready?" Marcus turned back, surprised. Mike rarely asked about preparation this close to fight time. "Yeah, boss, always am." "Good." Mike paused, studying Marcus's face, the scar tissue around his eyes, the slightly flattened nose, the quiet confidence of a man who'd learned to channel violence into purpose. "After tonight, maybe we take a week off, let things settle down." "Things?" Marcus's eyebrow raised. "Or that Castellano punk?" Mike didn't answer directly. Instead, he looked around the warehouse, at the fighters preparing for battle, the spectators arriving for entertainment, the crew setting up equipment with practiced efficiency. All of it built on his reputation, his connections, his ability to control the violence that lived at the heart of their world. 15 years ago, he'd lost control once. A corrupt cop had pushed too hard, threatened too much, and Mike's hands had done what they were trained to do without his permission. The official story called it a mugging. The real story lived in his nightmares and in the careful distance he'd maintained from anything resembling a real life ever since. Now Ray Castellano's son was circling like a shark that smelled blood in the water, carrying his father's arrogance and his own hunger for respect. The boy had no idea he was poking at a wound that had never properly healed. Mike touched his phone, thinking about the one person who could pull him back from whatever was coming. But some calls were too dangerous to make, and some people were too precious to risk. Tonight, he would watch other men bleed for money and pretend his own ghosts weren't stirring. The call came at 2:47 a.m., 3 hours after the last fight ended, and the warehouse had emptied of spectators, fighters, and the intoxicating scent of violence. Mike sat alone in his makeshift office, a converted shipping container, lined with security monitors counting the night's take when his phone buzzed against the metal desk. Unknown number. Local area code. He almost didn't answer. In his world, calls after midnight usually brought bad news or desperate fighters looking for last-minute spots on fight cards. But something made him reach for the device. Maybe the same instinct that had kept him alive through 2 decades of professional violence and 15 years in Detroit's underworld. Yeah? Is this Michael Torino? The voice was female, middle-aged, with the careful pronunciation of someone who'd spent years in courtrooms or government offices. Depends who's asking. A pause. Then, my name is Detective Sarah Martinez, Detroit PD. I think we need to talk. Mike's blood turned to ice water. Cops calling at this hour meant only one thing: someone had connected dots that were supposed to stay scattered. His mind raced through the evening's events, calculating exposure and risk. Johnny Castellano's visit, the warehouse full of witnesses, the underground fights that existed in the gray spaces between legal and prosecutable. About what? He asked, keeping his voice steady. About Detective Ray Castellano, and about what really happened 15 years ago. The phone felt like it weighed 50 pounds in Mike's hand. Around him, the security monitors showed empty corridors and silent loading bays, but he could feel walls closing in from every direction. Ray Castellano's name was a ghost he'd buried deep, and now someone was digging up the grave. I don't know what you're talking about. Mr. Torino, Detective Martinez's voice carried the patience of someone who'd questioned hundreds of suspects over the years. I have Ray Castellano's personal files, his real files, not the sanitized version Internal Affairs released after his death. I know about the betting syndicates, I know about the fights he wanted you to throw, and I know you were the last person to see him alive. Mike closed his eyes, seeing that alley again. Ray Castellano's face in the dim streetlight, cocky and confident right up until the moment he realized he'd miscalculated. The detective had been so sure his badge and his threats would be enough to control a man whose hands had ended careers in Madison Square Garden. What do you want? To meet tonight. There's something you need to see before Johnny Castellano finds out what I've found. Johnny, the name hit Mike like a body shot. What about Johnny? He's been asking questions about his father's death. Filed a formal request to reopen the case 3 months ago. I've been sitting on it, but after tonight, after what happened at your warehouse, I can't sit anymore. Martinez paused. Mr. Torino, that boy is going to get himself killed if he keeps pushing, and he's going to take you down with him unless we handle this right. Mike stood up, pacing the narrow confines of his office. Through the security monitors, he watched Marcus loading equipment into their truck, preparing for the breakdown that would erase all evidence of tonight's fights. Normal procedure. Normal cleanup for a normal evening in the underground. But nothing would be normal again after this call. How do you know about tonight? He asked. I know because I've been watching the Castellano kid for months. I know about his crew, his territory claims, his daddy issues, and I know he came to your warehouse tonight looking for trouble he's not equipped to handle. Martinez's voice softened slightly. I also know you could have killed him and chose not to. That tells me something about who you've become in the last 15 years. Mike thought about Johnny's face so much like his father's, carrying the same arrogance and the same fundamental misunderstanding of how violence really worked. Ray Castellano had died because he'd tried to control a force he couldn't comprehend. Now his son was walking the same path with the same blind confidence. Where do you want to meet? Lincoln Street Bridge, 20 minutes. Come alone, and Mr. Torino, bring whatever conscience you've been hiding under all that guilt. You're going to need it for what comes next. The line went dead. Mike stared at the phone, feeling the last 15 years of careful control crumbling around him. He'd built this underground empire on the foundation of one terrible night, using his reputation and his connections to create something that mattered in Detroit's forgotten spaces. Now Ray Castellano's ghost was rising, wearing his son's face and carrying a detective's questions that had no safe answers. He thought about calling Marcus, warning him that everything might change. He thought about running, taking the cash from tonight's fights and disappearing into whatever life former champions built when their past finally caught up with them. Instead, Mike grabbed his jacket and headed for his truck. Some ghosts couldn't be outrun, and some debts could only be paid in truth. The night air tasted like rain and reckoning as he drove toward Lincoln Street Bridge and whatever Detective Martinez had waiting for him in the darkness. The Lincoln Street Bridge stretched across the Detroit River like a steel backbone, its rusted girders catching fragments of streetlight that turned the darkness into a patchwork of shadows and amber glow. Mike's truck rumbled to a stop at the eastern approach, where the industrial district bled into abandoned lots and forgotten infrastructure projects that had died with the city's manufacturing dreams. Detective Martinez was already there. She stood beside an unmarked sedan, a compact woman in her late 40s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Even in the dim light, Mike could see the careful way she positioned herself, weight-balanced, hands free, eyes scanning the approaches. 20-year cop instincts, the kind that kept you breathing in a city where the wrong conversation could end in gunfire. Mike climbed out of his truck, leaving the engine running. Old habits always have an exit strategy. "Mr. Torino," Martinez nodded as he approached. "Thank you for coming. Didn't seem like I had much choice." Mike stopped about 10 feet away, close enough to talk, far enough to move if things went sideways. "You want to tell me what this is really about?" Instead of answering, Martinez reached into her jacket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a manila folder thick with papers. "Ray Castellano wasn't the cop his son thinks he was. Most cops aren't. No." Martinez's voice carried 15 years of accumulated disgust. "But Ray was special. He had connections to every dirty betting operation in the city, took payments from 3 different syndicates, played them against each other, skimmed money from police evidence lockers." She held up the folder. "I've been tracking his network for 2 years, following the money trail he left behind." Mike felt his chest tighten. "Why?" "Because Ray Castellano destroyed my partner's career." The words came out flat, professional, but Mike caught the anger underneath. "Detective Tom Walsh, good cop, 23 years on the force. Ray fed him false information about a gambling ring, set him up to raid the wrong warehouse while the real operation moved 50 kilos of cocaine through the port. Tom got blamed for the missed bust, lost his pension, his marriage, his reputation." The pieces started clicking together in Mike's mind. "Your partner committed suicide." Martinez nodded. 3 years ago, left behind evidence about Ray's operation, but internal affairs buried it. Said Tom was a disgraced cop looking to blame others for his failures." Her knuckles were white around the folder's edges. "I've been investigating Ray's network ever since, off the books, building a case that nobody wants to hear." Mike understood now. This wasn't about justice, it was about revenge. Detective Martinez was carrying her own ghosts, her own need to balance scales that had been tipped by dirty cops and institutional corruption. In another life, he might have respected that. Tonight, it just made her dangerous. "What does this have to do with Johnny?" Johnny's been digging into his father's death, filed Freedom of Information requests, talked to retired cops, pressed witnesses who never wanted to be found. Martinez opened the folder, revealing police reports, financial documents, surveillance photos. "He's getting close to the truth about what Ray really was. And when he finds out his father wasn't some heroic cop but a corrupt piece of garbage who extorted fighters and took mob money." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "Kid's going to lose his mind," Mike said quietly. "Worse, he's going to come after you. Johnny's built his whole identity around avenging his father's death. When he realizes the man who killed Ray was justified, that Ray was the real criminal, it won't matter. He'll need someone to blame, and you're the only target left." Mike thought about Johnny's face earlier that evening, the pride when he'd mentioned Ray Castellano's name, the swagger of a young man who'd built his reputation on his father's legacy. Take that foundation away and what was left? Just another angry kid with a gun and nothing to lose. "You could have told me this over the phone," Mike said. "Why the midnight meeting?" Martinez hesitated, and in that pause Mike saw something that made his blood run cold. Fear, not the professional caution of a cop working a dangerous case, but the deep personal terror of someone who'd seen too much and knew exactly what was coming. Because Johnny Castellano isn't the only one asking questions anymore. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. There's someone else, someone connected to Ray's old operation who wants those files buried permanently. Who? I don't know, but they killed Tony Marchetti last week. The name hit Mike like a sledgehammer. Tony had been Ray's partner 15 years ago, the cop who'd found Ray's body in that alley and filed the report that called it a robbery gone wrong. If someone was cleaning house, eliminating witnesses to whatever Ray had really been involved in, they're going to come for me, Mike realized. Martinez nodded. And when they do, Johnny's going to be caught in the crossfire. That boy has no idea what kind of fire he's playing with. The Detroit River flowed beneath them, dark water carrying the city's secrets toward Lake Erie. Mike stared into the current, thinking about the careful life he'd built in the underground, the fighters who depended on him, the community that existed in the shadows of legitimate society. All of it balanced on the edge of a knife now, and the blade was starting to cut. "Show me the files," he said. Martinez hesitated. "Mr. Torino, show me." She opened the folder, spreading documents across the sedan's hood like evidence at a crime scene. Police reports, bank records, surveillance photos that captured Ray Castellano in hotel parking lots, exchanging briefcases with men Mike recognized from Detroit's gambling underworld. The paperwork painted a picture of corruption that went deeper than simple payoffs. Ray hadn't just been taking bribes, he'd been orchestrating entire operations. He was running point on the East Side protection racket, Martinez explained, her finger tracing bank deposits that corresponded with dates Mike remembered all too well. Taking 30% off every underground fight, every poker game, every betting operation from downtown to the river. When you refused to throw those matches, you weren't just defying one dirty cop, you were threatening a network that moved millions through the city. Mike's throat felt like sandpaper. I thought he was just muscle for hire. Ray was never just anything. Martinez pulled out a photograph that made Mike's vision blur at the edges. Ray Castellano shaking hands with Vincent the Knife Torino, Mike's own uncle, the man who'd introduced him to boxing and died in federal prison 3 years later. Your uncle was one of Ray's biggest clients. Ray protected Vinny's operations, and Vinny paid him enough to buy that house in Grosse Pointe where Johnny grew up thinking his daddy was a hero. The photograph felt like a betrayal 15 years in the making. Uncle Vinny had been the closest thing to a father Mike had ever known, teaching him how to fight and how to survive and how to recognize the difference between strength and violence. Finding out that Vinny had been connected to Ray Castellano, that Ray's corruption had roots in Mike's own family made that night in the alley feel like destiny instead of accident. Jesus, Mike whispered, it gets worse. Martinez's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd stared into an abyss for too long. Johnny isn't just investigating his father's death randomly. Someone's been feeding him information, directing his attention to specific witnesses, specific evidence. Someone who wants him to find you. Who? I think it's Ray's old lieutenant, Detective Frank Morrison, retired 5 years ago with full pension and a clean record that I now know was bought and paid for. She pulled out another photo, a heavy-set man with dead eyes and scarred hands. Morrison was the one who found Tony Marchetti's body. He was also the one who signed off on Ray's death report 15 years ago. Now Tony's dead, Morrison's disappeared, and Johnny's asking exactly the right questions to lead him straight to you. Mike felt the trap closing around him with mechanical precision. 15 years of careful living, of building something meaningful in the underground, of protecting fighters who had nowhere else to go, all of it orchestrated to collapse at exactly this moment. Someone had been planning this for years, using Johnny Castellano as an unwitting weapon aimed at Mike's heart. They're not just cleaning house, he realized. They're settling scores. Martinez nodded grimly. Ray's network didn't die with him. It evolved, got smarter, more careful, but there were always loose ends witnesses who knew too much. Cops who couldn't be fully trusted, fighters who'd seen things they shouldn't have. She gestured at the bridge, at the dark water below. You were supposed to disappear that night 15 years ago. Ray was supposed to kill you and dump your body in the river. When you killed him instead, you became a problem they've spent 15 years figuring out how to solve. The revelation hit Mike like a physical blow. All these years, he'd thought that night was about Ray's personal greed, his attempt to control one fighter's career for betting profits. Instead, it had been an execution that went wrong. Ray hadn't come to threaten him, he'd come to murder him. Why now? Mike asked. Why wait 15 years? Because now they have Johnny. Martinez's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They've got Ray's son so twisted up with rage and pride that he'll do their work for them. When Johnny kills you, and he will try, It won't be a mob hit or a police cover-up. It'll be a son avenging his father's death. Clean, justified, and impossible to investigate without making Johnny a victim too. Mike thought about the boy's face earlier that evening, the desperate hunger for respect that reminded him so much of his own young self. Johnny Castellano was being used by the same forces that had corrupted his father, turned into a weapon that would destroy the last witness to 15 years of accumulated sins. The worst part was knowing that Johnny would never see it coming. Just like his father, he thought he was the one in control. "There's something else," he said quietly, the words coming from a place deeper than conscious thought. "Something you don't know." Martinez looked up from the files, her cop instincts reading the change in his voice. "What?" Mike's hands shook as he reached for his wallet, extracting a worn business card he'd carried for 15 years like a talisman. The edges were soft with age, the ink faded, but the name was still legible. Detective Frank Morrison, Internal Affairs Division. "Morrison didn't just sign off on Ray's death report," Mike said, his voice hollow. "He's the one who called me that night. He's the one who told me where to meet Ray." The color drained from Martinez's face. "What are you talking about?" "I lied." The admission felt like swallowing glass. "I didn't just run into Ray in that alley. Morrison called me 3 hours before the fight, said Internal Affairs was investigating Ray's connection to fixed matches, said they needed my testimony to bring him down, but they had to do it quietly off the books. He told me Ray would be alone, scared, looking to make a deal." Mike's vision blurred as the memory crystallized with perfect, horrible clarity. Morrison's voice on the phone, calm and professional, explaining how Mike could help clean up corruption in the department, how meeting Ray in that specific alley would be safe, controlled, recorded for evidence. "He set me up," Mike whispered. "Morrison sent me there to die." Martinez grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his jacket. "You're saying Morrison was working with Ray? That Internal Affairs was compromised?" No. The truth hit Mike like a train, 15 years of self-deception crumbling in an instant. "I'm saying Morrison was Ray's boss. Morrison was the one running the network." The files scattered in the wind as Martinez stepped back, her professional composure finally cracking. "That's impossible. Morrison had a clean record. 25 years, commendations, model officer. Who better to run a corruption network than the cop in charge of investigating corruption?" Mike's laugh was bitter, empty. "I spent 15 years thinking I killed Ray in self-defense. Truth is, Morrison sent me there as an execution weapon. Ray was getting sloppy, asking too many questions about where the money was really going. Morrison needed him gone, and he needed someone else to take the blame." The pieces fell into place with sickening precision. Morrison's call hadn't been about justice. It had been about cleaning house. Send the angry fighter to confront the dirty cop, let them kill each other, problem solved. When Mike survived instead of Ray, Morrison had to adjust the plan. Let Mike disappear into the underground. Let guilt and paranoia keep him quiet. Wait for the perfect moment to finish the job. "Johnny," Martinez breathed. "Morrison's been feeding information to Johnny." Mike nodded, feeling hollow. Morrison probably reached out after Johnny started asking questions. Played the grieving colleague, the cop who'd always suspected there was more to Ray's death. Fed him just enough truth to keep him digging, but steered him away from the real corruption. Made sure Johnny's investigation would lead to me instead of him. "That son of a bitch." Martinez was already reaching for her phone. "I need to call this in, get protection for Johnny before what?" Mike's voice cut through her panic like a blade. "Before you tell your superiors that the cop they trusted to investigate police corruption was actually running the biggest protection racket in the city? That he's been orchestrating murders for 15 years while collecting a pension?" Martinez froze, the phone halfway to her ear. Mike could see the realization hitting her, how deep this went. How many people would have to be complicit for Morrison's operation to work? Internal Affairs, district commanders, maybe even the chief himself. Anyone who could have stopped Morrison but chose to look the other way. "They'll bury it," she whispered, "just like they buried my partner's evidence. Worse, they'll bury us." Mike took the phone from her trembling hand. "Morrison's not just cleaning up loose ends anymore. He's preparing for retirement. One last score, one final tie-up of old business, and then he disappears with 15 years of stolen money." In the distance, Mike heard the rumble of motorcycle engines, multiple bikes, moving fast through the industrial district. His blood turned to ice as he recognized the sound. Johnny's crew, riding hard toward the bridge with the desperate intensity of young men convinced they were finally getting their revenge. He's not just feeding Johnny information, Mike realized. Morrison told him where to find us. Martinez followed his gaze toward the approaching headlights, her cop instincts finally understanding the trap they'd walked into. This was never about getting justice for your partner, Mike continued, his voice flat with certainty. Morrison knew you were investigating Ray's network. He's been watching you, waiting for you to get close enough to the truth to become a problem. The motorcycles were getting closer, their engines echoing off the bridge's steel girders like thunder. Johnny Castellano was coming, carrying his father's name and his own rage, ready to kill the man he believed had destroyed his family. He had no idea he was being used as a weapon by the same corruption that had killed his father's soul years before Ray's body hit the pavement. "Two birds," Martinez said quietly. "He eliminates both of us tonight." Mike nodded, watching the lights grow brighter in the darkness. Morrison had played a perfect game using Johnny's grief, Martinez's guilt, and Mike's own 15 years of self-deception to orchestrate a final solution that would bury the truth forever. The only question now was whether any of them would live long enough to expose it. "Get behind the car," Mike told Martinez, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "When this goes sideways, you run for the warehouse district. Find a phone, call whoever you trust most in the department. I'm not leaving you here. You don't have a choice." Mike's eyes never left Johnny as the young man dismounted, his movements carrying the deadly grace of someone who'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind. "That boy's got 15 years of poison in his blood, and Morrison's made sure it's all aimed at me. You try to talk him down, you'll just become another target." The crew spread out in a practiced formation, blocking both ends of the bridge's walkway. Professional, disciplined. Mike recognized the tactics from his uncle's old operations. These weren't just angry kids riding motorcycles. Someone had been training them, teaching them how to move like soldiers. Johnny walked forward alone, his father's police badge gleaming on his leather jacket like a medal of honor. In the sodium lights, his face was a perfect echo of Ray Castellano's. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn jaw, the same expression of absolute moral certainty that had made his father so dangerous. 15 years, Johnny said, his voice carrying across the empty bridge with ceremonial weight. 15 years I've been waiting for this moment. Mike stepped away from Martinez's sedan, keeping his hands visible but ready. He'd survived too many confrontations to miss the subtle signs. Johnny's weight shifted forward on the balls of his feet, his right hand resting near the gun Mike could see outlined under his jacket. The boy was scared and trying to hide it, which made him 10 times more dangerous than simple anger would have. "Your father was a corrupt cop who tried to have me murdered," Mike said quietly. "Morrison's been lying to you about everything." "Bullshit." Johnny's voice cracked slightly, the first hint that Morrison's programming wasn't complete. "My dad was a hero. He died because he wouldn't let scum like you destroy this city. Ray died because he got greedy and started asking questions about money that didn't belong to him. Morrison killed him just like he killed your partner," Mike said, looking directly at Martinez. "Just like he's going to kill you when you've served your purpose." One of Johnny's crew members, a lean kid with prison tattoos covering his neck, shifted nervously. "Johnny, maybe we should—" "Shut up!" Johnny's command snapped like a whip, but Mike caught the uncertainty bleeding through his authority. The boy had built his entire identity around avenging his father's death, and now doubt was creeping in like acid through armor. "You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know what Morrison told me? What did he tell you exactly?" Mike took a half-step forward, watching Johnny's pupils dilate with fight-or-flight chemicals. "Did he show you evidence, or just give you stories? Did he explain why Ray was meeting me alone in an alley instead of bringing backup? Did he tell you about the bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, or the protection money, or the fighters Ray crippled for asking too many questions?" "Stop." Johnny's hand moved toward his gun, but the motion was hesitant. "You're lying. Martinez has the files. Bank records, surveillance photos, everything your father really was." Mike could feel the moment balancing on a knife's edge, Johnny's faith in his father's memory warring against evidence he didn't want to see. "Morrison's been using you as a weapon for 15 years, feeding your anger, pointing it at me so you wouldn't ask why a cop with a $20,000 salary could afford to send you to private school." Behind Johnny, his crew was exchanging glances that spoke volumes. These boys had grown up in the system, had learned to recognize the smell of institutional lies. They were starting to understand that their leader might be wrong about everything. "He's trying to get in your head," Johnny said, but his voice had lost its earlier conviction. "That's what killers do. They twist the truth, make you doubt." "Your father came to kill me that night," Mike interrupted. "Morrison sent him. When Ray died instead, Morrison had to wait 15 years for another chance. Tonight's not about justice, Johnny. It's about Morrison covering up a corruption network that goes all the way to the top." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, filled with the weight of 15 years of lies finally coming undone. Mike could see the exact moment when Johnny's certainty began to crumble, doubt flooding in where rage had been his only constant companion. That's when the sniper's bullet shattered Martinez's windshield. "Sniper!" he roared, tackling Johnny to the bridge's concrete surface as a second bullet sparked off the steel girder where the young man's head had been. "Morrison's cleaning house!" Johnny struggled beneath him, confusion and fury warring in his eyes. "What the hell? He's killing all the witnesses," Mike hissed, scanning the warehouse rooftops across the river. "Including you. You think Morrison wants Ray's son alive to ask questions about Daddy's real business?" A third shot punched through the sedan's rear window, confirming Mike's assessment of the shooter's position. Professional placement, military precision. Morrison had brought someone who knew how to end problems permanently. The crew was scrambling for cover behind their motorcycles, their street swagger evaporating in the face of real combat. "This is impossible," Johnny whispered, but his voice carried the hollow tone of someone watching their entire world collapse. "Morrison's been helping me. He gave me everything: addresses, evidence, witnesses." "He gave you a hit list." Mike's voice cut through the boy's denial like a blade. "Every witness Morrison fed you information about is probably dead now. Martinez's partner, Tony Marchetti, how many others? You've been his cleanup crew for 15 years and you never even knew it." Martinez's voice came from behind the engine block, tight with professional focus. "Movement on the warehouse roof, 2 shooters, maybe 3. Military-grade equipment." Another bullet shattered the bridge's safety lighting, plunging them into deeper darkness. In the brief muzzle flash, Mike caught a glimpse of tactical gear and infrared scopes equipment that cost more than Johnny's entire crew made in a year. Morrison wasn't just covering up police corruption anymore. This was private military, the kind of firepower you bought when retirement meant disappearing permanently. "Johnny," Mike's voice carried the weight of absolute truth. "Look at your boys. Look at how scared they are. Morrison sent you here to die." The kid with the neck tattoos was pressed flat against the concrete, tears streaming down his face. Another crew member had been clipped by glass, blood running from a dozen small cuts. These weren't hardened killers. They were neighborhood kids who'd followed Johnny's grief into something far darker than they'd understood. Johnny's hand finally found his gun, but instead of pointing it at Mike, he stared at the weapon like it was a snake. "He said we were getting justice. He said," his voice cracked completely, "he called me son." The admission hung between them like an open wound. Mike understood now how Morrison had played it, stepping into the hole Ray's death had left, becoming the father figure Johnny had never really had, teaching him to channel his grief into purpose, his questions into weapons aimed at everyone except the real enemy. "My father really was dirty," Johnny said, the words coming out like physical pain. "Everything you said about the money, the protection rackets, it's all true, isn't it?" Mike nodded, watching the last of Johnny's certainty die in his eyes. "Ray got in too deep and started asking questions about Morrison's operation. Morrison sent him to kill me, knowing I'd fight back. When Ray died instead, Morrison spent 15 years turning you into the perfect weapon to finish the job." A bullet ricocheted off the motorcycle nearest to them, sending up sparks that illuminated Johnny's face for one terrible moment. Mike saw his own young self reflected there, the same desperate hunger for meaning, the same willingness to believe that violence could somehow balance the scales of injustice. "What do we do?" Johnny's question came out as a whisper, all his adult authority stripped away to reveal the lost child beneath. Mike looked toward the warehouse rooftops, calculating angles and distances with the cold precision that had made him a champion. 3 shooters, elevated positions, professional equipment versus 2 cops, an underground fighter, and 4 terrified kids with nowhere to run. "We survive," he said simply, "and then we make Morrison pay for what he did to your father, what he did to all of us." Johnny met his eyes, and Mike saw something fundamental shift in the young man's expression. The rage was still there, but it wasn't pointed at him anymore. 15 years of misdirected fury was finally finding its true target. "Tell me what to do," Johnny said, his voice steady for the first time since the shooting started. Mike smiled grimly, feeling the familiar weight of decision settle into his bones. Morrison had orchestrated this perfectly, except for one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that truth would make them weaker. Instead, it had just made them angry. The warehouse district burned orange against the dawn sky. 3 buildings consumed by fires that would erase Morrison's operation from existence. Mike stood on the same bridge where it had all come apart 12 hours earlier, watching the smoke rise like incense for the dead. His knuckles were split raw, his jacket torn from crawling through industrial debris, but Morrison would never hurt another soul. Johnny Castellano sat on the bridge's concrete barrier beside him, his father's police badge turning slowly in his fingers. The boy looked older now. Grief would do that, strip away the comfortable lies and leave only truth's sharp edges. His crew had scattered after the shooting stopped, back to their neighborhoods and their small lives, but Johnny had stayed. Some weights couldn't be carried alone. 15 years, Johnny said quietly. 15 years I hated the wrong man. Mike nodded, remembering his own decades of misdirected guilt. Hate's easier than truth, gives you something to do with the pain. Morrison's dead. It wasn't a question. Johnny had seen Mike drag the corrupt cop from the warehouse, had heard the conversation that ended with Morrison's confession and his final wet breath. Think that makes it even? Nothing makes it even. Mike's voice carried the weight of hard experience. Your father was dirty, but he was still your father. Morrison was dirty and evil besides. One death doesn't balance another, it just stops the bleeding. Below them, Detroit's morning traffic was starting to build. Regular people heading to regular jobs, carrying regular problems that didn't involve corruption and murder and 15-year-old revenge plots. Mike envied them their simple troubles. Martinez's sedan pulled up at the bridge's approach, the detective moving slowly as she climbed out. She'd taken a bullet in the shoulder during the warehouse fight, but she'd stayed conscious long enough to call in federal backup. Morrison's files were already in FBI custody, along with evidence that would destroy careers and end lives across 3 states. The corruption network was finished. How's the arm? Mike asked as she approached. Hurts like hell, worth it. Martinez studied Johnny's profile, her cop instincts reading the damage there. Internal Affairs is going to want to talk to you both. There'll be questions, depositions, maybe a grand jury. They'll try to bury it, Johnny said without looking up from his father's badge. Too many important people involved. Too much money at stake. Maybe. But Morrison kept records, insurance, leverage, whatever you want to call it. Names, dates, bank transfers, recorded conversations. The FBI thinks they can flip half his network into witnesses. Martinez sat heavily on the barrier, fatigue finally showing in her shoulders. Your father's name will come out, Johnny, the whole truth. Mike watched the boy's face, saw him absorb that final blow with the stoicism of someone who'd already lost everything that mattered. Johnny had spent 15 years building a shrine to Ray Castellano's memory, and now that shrine would be torn down in federal court, brick by brick, lie by lie. Good, Johnny said finally. People should know who he really was. They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher, burning off the river's morning mist. Mike felt something shifting inside him. Not peace, exactly, but the absence of the weight he'd carried for so long. Ray Castellano's death would always be on his hands, but Morrison's blood had finally balanced those scales. Not justice, maybe, but closure. What now? Johnny asked. For you, I mean. Morrison's dead, his network's finished. You could go back to legitimate fighting, get your license reinstated. Mike considered it, returning to sanctioned boxing, proper venues, real crowds instead of the underground's desperate theater. But that world belonged to a younger man, one who hadn't spent 15 years learning that violence always extracted its price from everyone it touched. I'm done fighting, he said. There's a gym in Mexican town, kids who need somewhere to learn discipline instead of anger. Figured I might try teaching for a while. Johnny nodded, understanding. Think you'll be good at it? Think I know enough about anger to help them find something better. Martinez stood, checking her watch. I need to get to the hospital, then federal debriefing. Johnny, they're going to want your testimony about Morrison's recruitment methods, how he manipulated you. It won't be easy. None of this has been easy. Johnny pocketed his father's badge and looked directly at Mike for the first time since the warehouse. I'm sorry, for everything, for hating you, for hunting you, for believing Morrison's lies. You were protecting your father's memory. Can't fault a son for that. Even when the father doesn't deserve it. Mike thought of his own father, a dock worker who died young, leaving behind nothing but debts and the dream that his son might find something better than violence. Especially then. They parted ways as the morning grew warm, 3 people forever changed by one night's truth. Mike walked toward Mexican town, toward children who needed to learn that strength didn't require cruelty, that being hard didn't mean being broken. Behind him, the warehouses smoldered, Morrison's corruption finally reduced to ash and memory. In the distance, church bells marked the hour.